Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. My name is Sean Noel. I'm the Associate Director of the Howard Gotlieb Archival Research Center. We're the Rare Manuscript and Book Department here at the university. We're responsible for all the excellent exhibitions that you see on the first floor of the Mugar Library. And I'm sure you've received flyers and emails about a variety of our different programs. This is a relatively new format for us called Faculty Forum Chat. And we very much appreciate you coming. It's an opportunity to act as kind of a cultural presenter for the university and bring faculty members to you, give you an opportunity to engage in a discussion, question the experts, that sort of thing. So tonight we have the state of affairs, Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. And I'd like to say Professor Tom Barfield, who was going to be here tonight, just got back from a trip and was too sick to come, which I guess is what happens when you're in the field. Sometimes you come back. And we appreciate him not bringing whatever it was he had with him. But we have a group of faculty members here, Professor Andrew Basevich from International Relations, Professor Shahala Hayari from CAS, Anthropology and Women's Studies, and lecturer Aparna Pandey from International Relations as well, who will all speak briefly on the subject. And then we really are hoping that that will be engaging you in the conversation, and that when you have questions, the microphones are set up. There's one here and there's one here that'll turn back around so that we can hear you. We can all enjoy that. And Professor John Carroll from College of Communications is our moderator for the entire series. So last week we had CIA, two faculty members who talked about their CIA experiences. Next week we'll have Professor Carroll talking about the Kennedys and the seat of power, and that will be in the conference auditorium. So if you're interested in that, we hope you come back. All the events are free. At the end of the night, I'll plug a few more of our events, but I'd really just like to thank our faculty members for coming, and thank you for coming, and I'll turn it over to Professor Carroll. Professor Carroll?
Thank you very much, John. Appreciate it. And thank you all for being here. We're delighted to be here, and we're delighted that you're here as well to talk about the situation, a very complicated, obviously, and volatile situation in the greater Middle East. And we've got three people here who are experts. I'm going to ask each one of them to address a different country: Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, just to get us started and to get us oriented. And from that point on, we'll start talking about the interrelations and also some of the ramifications of what's going on over there. So, Professor Basevich, I'd like to start with you. Today or yesterday, it was reported that Matthew Ho, a State Department official, resigned. He resigned last month, and he said he resigned based not upon how we are pursuing the war, but why and to what end. Could you give us your overview of why and to what end we're in Afghanistan?
Sure. And I brought what Professor Barfield didn't bring, so I apologize for my voice. I'll try to make 3 points on Afghanistan in 3 minutes in the form of 3 questions. Question number 1, what are the United States and its allies trying to achieve in Afghanistan? I think the answer to the question is that we're engaged in an effort to pacify the country and to do it through the implementation of some variant of counterinsurgency. I think the argument that's going on within the administration is trying to gauge really the intensity of the counterinsurgency effort, not really to decide whether there's going to be such an effort made. And now counterinsurgency ought to be understood really as an enterprise that is an exercise in armed nation building. That will attempt to transform Afghanistan into some version of a cohesive, functioning nation-state governed out of Kabul by legitimate and effective national institutions. In other words, it is a great big project. Question number 2, how much will it cost? Well, counterinsurgencies are by definition, certainly sustained by any number of historical cases, very long, drawn-out propositions. A counterinsurgency is a protracted war. It is a protracted war fraught with risk, likely to produce, even in the best of circumstances, an ambiguous outcome that doesn't look anything like traditional military victory. We need to understand that at this juncture, the $300 or so billion already spent in Afghanistan since 2001, along with the several hundred Allied soldiers who have already been killed, These are simply sunk costs. That we are at this moment further from success in Afghanistan than we were 5 or 6 years ago. Now, I mention that because what we have is a war that, as you know, is more than 8 years old, and if counterinsurgency proponents get their way, it's going to last many more years, and it's going to consume many more hundreds of billions of dollars, and will certainly cost the lives of hundreds, if not thousands, of Allied soldiers. Question number 3, is the effort in Afghanistan worth it? Well, if Afghanistan is in fact jihad central, then perhaps the answer to that question might be yes. That is, if success in Afghanistan will drive a stake through the heart of violent jihadism, then perhaps it makes sense to extend an 8-year-long war so that it becomes a 10-year-long or a 15-year-long war. The problem, of course, is that Afghanistan is not jihad central. If we could wave a magic wand and effect the complete pacification of Afghanistan by tomorrow morning, the truth is that violent jihadism would not be appreciably reduced. And you know why that is the case. The phenomenon is a transnational one. You're as likely to find evidence of the threat, as we call it, in Brooklyn or Denver or London as in Afghanistan. Furthermore, to the extent that jihadists require some kind of sanctuary in ungoverned spaces, then Afghanistan is by no means the only available option. So no, it's not worth it. The Afghanistan war, in my judgment, serves mostly to inhibit serious analysis of what is required to address the problem of violent jihadism, and it serves to perpetuate the illusion that the antidote to jihadism is to be found in the determined exercise of military power. Thank you.
A very effective 3-minute drill. Thank you. One of the things that I was reading some of Professor Bacevich's writings, and one of the things he talked about in a recent op-ed was that to stabilize Afghanistan is essentially to destabilize Pakistan, because what's happening is the problems are just crossing over the border. And so we turn to Pakistan next. And Professor Pandey, there have been 10 major militant attacks in Pakistan in October. Just in October. There was one today, car bomb in Peshawar, that was a real exclamation point on the visit by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Can you lead us through and give us some sense of the sort of civil-military balance or imbalance that we're encountering now and everyone is encountering now in Pakistan?
Thank you, Professor Carroll. I would like to make 2 points, basically answer to 2 questions. One ties into what Professor Basevich said, that why is the US in Afghanistan, what is it trying to achieve in Afghanistan? A lot of people are arguing these days with President Obama's decision whether or not to send troops, if the real problem is in Afghanistan or in Pakistan. And there are 2 elements to it. One is Pakistan a really useful ally for the United States? Should the United States be putting in a lot more money, as it is giving $7.5 billion of aid, and more military aid? And secondly, what are the dynamics within Pakistan? The relationship between the civilians and the military, especially with respect to the rising violence and other problems. The PowerPoint, please. Next slide, first one. Yeah. Couple of points which I'd like to talk about are, one, that out of 62 years of existence, Pakistan has basically been under military rule for more than half of that period. It's a very, very weak civilian government and a very strong military establishment. Secondly, next slide, please, is that over the years, that not only the military, but even the civilian bureaucracy has built up a very strong thank you, legacy and power and influence. And along with that, along with having a weak civilian government, a strong military, a strong civil service, a very weak judiciary. What the present civilian government is trying to do is trying to make up for what happened in the last, or did not happen in the last 60 years. Next slide, please. From Pakistan's point of view, as well as from the United States' point of view, there have been certain disenchantment or different, let's say, perception of how you look at the relationship. For the United States, Pakistan has always been an ally for communism during the Cold War and the war against terror, against the terror threat for the last 8 years. However, from Pakistan's side, United States was always seen as an ally who would try and help Pakistan build itself against India. Communism was never, or very rarely ever, the real threat or the real reason. And so the relations have been problematic right from the beginning. Despite a large amount of aid being given to Pakistan, next slide please, about $23 billion in the last, between 1954 and 2008, most of this aid has gone for military and security purposes. Very little for civilian government, or let's say for governance, democracy, development. I'd like to go to the second last slide, if you could, because I have, I think, a minute left, or? No, before that, please. One more. Yeah. Part of the problem has been, which ties into the perception of the Pakistani military, intelligence, as well as the civilian administration for decades, has been that the military has seen a number of the jihadi groups which it is fighting these days, both for domestic reasons and for international reasons. It has normally seen them as assets against Afghanistan and against India. Against Afghanistan in the sense that for Pakistan, in order to stand up to the much larger country on the eastern frontier, that is India, it needed a friendly country on the western border. And these jihadi groups would help achieve, let's say, a pro-Pakistan government in Afghanistan. And on the eastern border, the jihadi groups creating tensions in Kashmir and other parts of India would keep the Indian army occupied and therefore less threatening to Pakistan and the Pakistani military. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. And completing the tinderbox trifecta is Iran. So, Professor Hayeri, you have been to Iran pre-election, I believe, and you can give us some sense of the environment there, the conditions there, and sort of the political sensibilities that are in play in Iran.
I would be happy to. Hello, everyone, and thank you, Professor Carroll. Well, I come from a different discipline, anthropology, so I provided you with some visual images of what the political scene was before the election. And as you know, I mean, I start with the map, and you understand Iran is almost sandwiched between Iraq and Afghanistan, and on the other side, Pakistan and the Gulf states. So you can imagine that it can feel quite insecure politically. But that's besides the point. There's another, I mean, well, maybe that is the point, but for the election, there was a lot of enthusiasm this time because to understand what happened in this particular election, we have to go back to previous elections, which I don't have time to do that right now, but maybe during the question and answer I'll be able to tell you. But what I want to tell you is that this particular election had become very, very crucial for people because in 2005, there was a sense that there was a massive fraud at that time. But for whatever reasons, for political reasons, for cultural reasons, and maybe the fact that Iran, again, was in the middle of this, countries where there is so much fighting going on, Then those who objected to the result of the election of 2005 kept quiet, and many actually boycotted that election. But then as we got closer to the election of 2005, there was a tremendous enthusiasm because many assumed, rightly or wrongly, that this would be a very important election. And for that matter, there was a huge push to get everyone to come to the poll and to give elections. I have provided these images for you just to tell you the excitement, the enthusiasm that people had before the elections. And of course, you can see, you can go a little bit faster. I mean, you know, what happened was that the opposition, well, there were only 4 people who were qualified by the Guardian Council, and I can tell you about who the Guardian Council is. But briefly, it's a political body that vets the candidacy of all the candidates to national offices in Iran. So there were only 4 of them, and the 2 reformist one of them chose the color green. As you can see, I'm wearing the green as the symbol of the election. No sooner had he done that than the powers that be and the government accused Mousavi, who had chosen the color green as a symbol of the election, as the subversive individual intent on bringing green velvet revolution and all the rest. But nobody really paid much attention, and there was a call that went out for people to demonstrate in various places. Often the permission wouldn't come. But in this particular one that you just saw, Mr. Khatami, who's a very, very important character as a reformist candidate, why it was so important for the people who defrauded the election not to allow another reformist candidate to come to power. But then nonetheless, he supported Mr. Mousavi. And I hope you understand who these characters are, because I'm just assuming that there is a certain knowledge there. Anyhow, there was people who just appeared in these elections despite the fact that the state refused to give them permission, even though permission to hold peaceful rallies is guaranteed in the Constitution, but at that time the Constitution was not given much credence. So anyways, there was these demonstrations, and there was one particular one 3 days before the election that I call it the green chain. I mean, I don't call it, it was called the green chain of demonstrations. And it was amazing. I mean, the chain of green that people created. Imagine a street like Massaf that goes from, I don't know where to where. It's a huge street. And in that street, people just walked out, people of all classes, all backgrounds, all ages. And please don't think that the people who came to these demonstrations were just the elite or the westernized or the, I don't know, the very educated one. People of all classes, all backgrounds, all walks of life came to the streets to express their discontent with the elections. And one of the things they talked about, and I will say that in the stub, we can watch the, after the election, the slides that I have for you, the assumption, or, well, I think, the claim was that they have been lied to. And so they wanted the state to stop being deceiving people, particularly as far as inflation was concerned, as far as security of the country was concerned, as far as the budget that was spent on all other activities other than what people needed to. So one big, well, you'll see these images, slogan that people had, and of course was stop lying. And Iranians are very inventive in making up slogans, and that was quite fun, just going around. So you can just go, you can see that, all these things have to do with lies. Well, maybe I'll just stop here and we'll talk. I have a slides from after the election, and then I'll be happy to take.
Okay, so let's tally this all up. We've got 2 illegitimate governments and 1 ineffective government. Am I reading the situation over there correctly? Is there the possibility of some kind of domino effect here? If, for instance, the Pakistani government was more willing to confront the Taliban, could that do something, change the dynamic in Afghanistan? that would make the U.S. role there either more efficient or more clear-cut?
The Pakistani government is taking on the Taliban. It's just that it's doing it selectively. So what it's doing is that it is going after those groups which are attacking Pakistan or the Pakistani government and military security. So when the Taliban attacked the general headquarters early in October, that's when the South Waziristan operation was launched. So, but even there, they've undertaken alliances with some of the groups in South Waziristan, and they're only attacking one group, the Mahsood faction. And they are also not going after the groups in other parts of Pakistan, in southern Punjab, the sectarian groups, the groups who launch attacks in Kashmir. It's a very selective. It has to be an all-out fight, and they have to actually plan for it to make a difference.
So, Professor Bacevich, do you think it would make a difference in Afghanistan if they changed?
Well, it's a good question that I'd never thought of, and my inclination is to say no. And I say that because it seems to me that these three countries are so radically different in their histories and in sort of what the national project is about. I mean, an analogy might be, to speak about another subject about which I know next to nothing, the history of Latin America. I've always been impressed by the way that reform ideas in Latin America. In the interwar period, there was a sort of flirtation with fascism. In the 50s and in the early Castro era, there was a fascination with socialist revolution. That was followed by a trend towards neoliberalism. To some degree, today in Latin America, we have a slide back towards some version of socialism. That trends seem to be regional. You know, what happens in Nicaragua kind of happens in Honduras. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that's the case with regard to the three countries that we're talking about. And so I don't think there would be any kind of a domino effect.
I want to emphasize the fact that Iran is very different historically, geographically, politically. It's what forms the country, the history, the civilization. It's quite different from Pakistan and Afghanistan.
So how do they see themselves in relation to their neighbors? They've got a very unstable situation surrounding them. You talked about the sort of the internal dynamics, but what about the sense of the people and maybe the government too, of their position in that sort of triangle?
Well, legitimately, Iranian government feels threatened by the mere fact that the NATO government, the NATO forces are in Afghanistan, and Pakistan is in the grip of Taliban, and in the Gulf, the American forces are stationed there. So Iran does feel very insecure. And then maybe for that matter, they think that they have the right to control the state, to control the government, or to put in the seat of the presidency whomever they think is in the position or capable of confronting these uncertainties that are coming from Pakistan and Afghanistan and Iraq, But I have to say that, and I'd like to hear what other things think. Iran has tried to reach out to these governments, and initially it was actually a partner, however we may want to define this one, with the U.S. I mean, they welcomed the fact that Saddam was overthrown, or that the Taliban were kicked out and all that, but because of the dynamics of the relationship of the U.S. to these governments or to the Iranian government, things quickly changed, I would say, for the worse.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to weigh in?
And there are some tensions between Iran and Pakistan recently. Right. Again, the Jindal attack on the Iranian guards, and President Ahmadinejad's statement that Pakistan is harboring those terrorists. This is a Sunni militant organization which is based out of southwestern Pakistan, that is Baluchistan, which undertakes attacks in Iranian Baluchistan, fighting for the Sunni minority, as they say. But they have built ties over the years with the jihadi groups within Pakistan. But Pakistan sees threats on all sides. In that sense, it's a bit different again, as from Afghanistan and Iran. Pakistan sees threat from India, from the India-US relationship, from Afghanistan and the India-Afghanistan-US relationship, from the troops in Afghanistan, from Iran and from Baluchistan. So it has its own dynamic where it sees threats outside as well as within.
It's an area gripped in uncertainty and insecurity, you know.
Professor Bacevich, you talk about how the war is becoming a permanent condition in Afghanistan, and your sense is that there's an alternative to this, which involves the warlords and sort of a transfer of power. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I mean, my basic argument begins with a question, and the question is, what exactly are U.S. interests in Afghanistan? The widespread assumption in Washington seems to be that Afghanistan is a vital national security interest, and that assumption, I think, doesn't get examined. To examine it, it seems to me, reveals that it's quite specious, that we do have interests in Afghanistan, and they frankly are limited to the need to prevent Afghanistan from once again becoming a sanctuary for al-Qaeda. Beyond that, we don't have any serious interest in Afghanistan. And the question therefore becomes, what's the most cost-effective way to achieve our limited interests? And does a protracted war, I mean, again, when one wants to sort of pound the table and say, the war is already 8 years old, and the conversation in Washington really revolves around the prospect of extending it for several more years. I think the question is there a more cost-effective way to achieve our limited interest? And I believe that there are some pretty plausible alternatives. The one is the so-called counterterrorism strategy, which basically says that rather than a comprehensive counterinsurgency campaign, let's try to establish a comprehensive system of surveillance and intelligence collection so that we have some sense of where al-Qaeda is and what they're doing. And to the extent that the Afghanistan government tolerates or encourages their presence, then we would need to use rather specific military action to, at a minimum, keep them on the run, preferably confront al-Qaeda with a sort of a continuing leadership succession crisis as they continually try to figure out who's in charge. And if that's the circumstance in which they exist, it'll become very difficult to mount any attacks. I'm not trying to tell you that that would be cheap or easy. I do believe it would be much cheaper and probably easier than trying to transform Afghanistan into a modern nation state.
Mm-hmm. And then what happens in Afghanistan? Do they just go back to fighting among themselves? And that's what we monitor?
Well, I mean, I think the United States has a pretty limited capacity to determine the fate of other nations, and that we kid ourselves when we imagine otherwise. We're pretty good at kidding ourselves on that score. And the fact of the matter is that the Afghan people are going to have to sort this thing out for themselves. You mentioned the Matthew Ho resignation letter, which is a very interesting document. And one of the things that Matthew Ho says is, first of all, he says that the insurgents aren't fighting for the Taliban, they're fighting against the foreign occupiers. And the second thing he says is that the essence of the conflict within Afghanistan is really a dispute between a portion of the population that is committed to a traditional way of life, a traditional or perhaps even conservative definition of Islam, and that group, that part of the population, is pitted against another part of the population that is committed to modernity, that probably has a different view of the role that Islam ought to play in public life or even private life. That's a very fundamental internal dispute, and I think it's preposterous to think that a bunch of secularized, mostly Christian soldiers are going to, walk down the street and try to referee that disagreement.
So let's stick with overriding U.S. interests, and then maybe we'll open it up for questions. Professor Pandey, the overriding U.S. interest in Pakistan would be what? Can you talk about that a little bit?
To prevent the state from, in a future stage, collapsing, especially since it has nuclear weapons. It's 176 million people. It's right next to a country which is about 1 billion people and has nuclear weapons. If the state doesn't necessarily, I won't necessarily say it's going to fail, but if the attacks by the jihadi groups increase and in different parts of Pakistan, and the civilian government isn't able to hold control, what will the military do? And these groups can cause havoc in the neighboring countries, in Iran, in Afghanistan, in India. So from that point of view, it's important. That would be of interest to the United States to prevent that country from collapsing or failing in the future.
And Professor Hayeri, in Iran, the U.S. is in a very tricky, ticklish situation because they don't want to look like they're going in there and trying to manage the elections. They're trying very hard, the Obama administration in particular, not to look like they're taking sides one way or another. They just keep saying the Iranian people decide who's their legitimate government and who's not. But in the end, what does the U.S. want to happen, best case scenario, in Iran?
Well, I think so far I would give President Obama credit to have stayed out of the election battles. That was very fierce, that was very important, that was raging in Iran. I think ultimately it's the people who have to decide whom they want, and I very much agree with Professor Basowicz. It's presumptuous to think that you know what's best for the country. And for that matter, I think, I don't know how much of these slides you could see, I didn't see many of them as you were watching. I think it's the people who decided that they really wanted to have a democratic election. And this is not something new, and this is not something that happened in the past 25 years. This desire to have a truly accountable, representative, democratic government has been with the Iranians for at least 100 years, starting with the constitutional revolution of 1906. So, and this is a very educated public. The literacy rate is high, and despite what you may see for women wearing the scarf and all that, women are everywhere. In the college, of course, interestingly, in colleges in Iran, 65% of student body is women. So I think it's very important to understand what people desire. And so far, the United States has played its role quite effectively. And I think it has been very important for Iranians, particularly those leaders who were in danger of being accused of being a pawn in the hands of the imperialists, the Zionists, all these other former colonial regimes, that not to have the American government to come out and throw its support behind one particular candidate or another. I don't know exactly what American government or the U.S. government wants. Obviously, it's better to have a secular, democratic system in Iran. But as I said, we just have to realize that we're dealing with people, and people know what they want. And so to just put sanctions on them, throw bombs on them, to try to put screws on them and all that, it's really it's counterproductive. It's not going to serve the interest of the U.S. Because right now, you might be surprised to know that, in fact, Iranians are very pro-Americans. Unlike what may appear, the Iranians are very pro-Americans, and I'm sure many appreciate the fact that the U.S. has stayed out of the election, situation in Iran.
Any other background that you want to fill in before we throw it open to the students? So I think we'd like to let you ask your questions. So if you would come to the microphone and identify yourself. And also, please pose your question in the form of a question. We would love to hear from you. Seriously.
Hi, my name is Tarif. I'm in the Cass School. I'm studying international relations. My question was, first, the upcoming re-election in Afghanistan with President Karzai. This is very important to the U.S. in that the election results determine our policy, I think. What would the optimal outcome be for us? And let's say that the elections go bad again, what would the U.S. do from that point?
Professor Vesevich?
Well, I think the optimal, from the point of view of the United States and its interests, the optimal outcome is a second round in the election that appears to be reasonably honest, resulting in the election of a president that we can work with. I don't have any idea how likely those two things are to happen. If we don't get that, then the president's problem, which is already very difficult, becomes 3 times more difficult because opponents of the counterinsurgency idea will cite the non-existence of a legitimate government in Kabul as a further reason to oppose the notion of staying the course. I think the real part of the president's problem here is that the decision clock on whether or not to approve the McChrystal plan is different from the election clock. Ideally, he would wait until the election occurred and the outcome was determined before making a decision on troop levels and strategies. But my sense is that the pressure for him to make a decision on troops and strategy is really building up, and so it's going to become very difficult for him to wait until the election results are determined.
Either of the other professors want to add anything? I don't want to restrict you to your respective countries here. Okay.
That's good. That means I can make grand pronouncements about Iran.
Absolutely, absolutely. Jump in the pool.
I was going to ask you a question.
My name is Kenry Mizutani. I'm a student here at International Relations and Economics departments. I have 2 questions. The first question is, could you elaborate on the role of economic development particularly in Afghanistan and Pakistan in terms of fighting counterinsurgency, how effective it has been so far? I believe the U.S. military showed the intention of doubling its budget allocated for winning the hearts and minds of Afghan people over the summer, how effective it has been. The second question is, you mentioned the political dynamics between Pakistan and Afghanistan. Could you elaborate on the political dynamics between Afghanistan and Iran? Thank you.
Professor Panda, you want to start?
The U.S. Is actually giving around $700 million in the Pentagon, actually. It's separate from the Kerry-Lugar aid package. This is the DOD and Pentagon is giving counterinsurgency money, and General Petraeus or CENTCOM will have control over that for training Pakistani forces as well as paramilitary troops. It's not been very successful up till now because the Pakistani military does not want to be seen as being trained by the Americans. The Frontier Corps, which is a paramilitary force in the tribal areas, has received some training. However, counterinsurgency in the sense of you actually creating development and governance in those areas is very, very weak in Pakistan. Very weak security. It's not been developed. What the hope is that the Kerry-Lugar bill has talked about something called Reconstruction Opportunity Zones, or ROZs, in Afghanistan and Pakistan, where products will be manufactured by locals and they will be bought by Americans as well as by Europeans with let's say very low tariff or very low duties. But that will take a couple of years. And we have to see, how far both governments cooperate, and with the rising anti-Americanism in Pakistan, that's going to be very difficult for the Pakistani government as well as the American government.
And what about some kind of Afghanistan-Iran mashup here?
Well, I mean, Iranians have always felt close to Afghans culturally, but they've thought of them as their younger sister that needs to be led or directed, or, you know, Iranians have this sense of perhaps superiority at times, which is not good. But I think on the whole, Iranians have been supportive of the move to unseat the Taliban. And as I said, they welcomed the American forces when they went to Afghanistan. But they have been very frustrated by the way that U.S. policy has developed, and later on the NATO policies have developed in Afghanistan. There were several projects that Iranians wanted to have with the Afghans, the Afghan government, which were prevented from being implemented. Nonetheless, Iranians were able, with the help of, you know, the local governments in Herat, to build a big highway. Also, one thing that's interesting, I mean, we were talking about some generalities, and as an anthropologist, I want to say something about some specific issues. Afghan, pretty much like Iran, but Afghans perhaps more so, they have quite a few well-established, ancient and traditional ethnic groups. But what's interesting to know is the dynamics between the Pashtun and the Tajik. And as far as the language, and which is a very important factor to be taken into account, the language of the education has always been Persian, Tajik, or Dari as they call it. And the language of the elite or the ruling government has been Pashto. Now, Iranians came in early on trying to provide a lot of books, to revamp the educational system, to help them to build up their libraries. And in fact, I was there in 2006, and I saw a huge amount of books that the Iranian government had donated. And in fact, I took a lot of books from Iran to Afghanistan. But then again, that was frustrated because, again, the sense of rivalry that for some reason being, ethnic rivalry, that for some reason is being encouraged, was palpable in the university where it has always had Dari or Persian as its language of education. Now there were the Pashtun nationalists who were trying to say, no, we need to have the Pashtun language. It is important to recognize it and to give credence also to that language as well. But what happened was that the library or the bookstore that had the Persian books was closed down, and it was just locked up when I was there. So there's a lot of, you know, tension that was being encouraged between the ethnic groups, and Iranian government, of course, on its own part, may try to add to that, you know. But I think it's important to understand the relationship between Iran and Afghanistan, not just as a brotherly or sisterly relationship between the two of them that goes way back for centuries, but also as there's this outside element that comes in and then tries to influence that and perhaps change it the way that it wants. So it's very important to understand the dynamics, not between Iran and Afghanistan, but between Iran and what's going on around it. And of course, the U.S. dominance in the region, it's very important.
I tend to be very skeptical about the efficacy of economic development programs. And my skepticism comes from my own reading of the history of development in the underdeveloped world, and the countries that make it, as it were, are countries that have made it, I think, for a variety of cultural and political reasons, and have made it without any particular assistance from the United States. You know, we're talking about Taiwan or the People's Republic of China or Singapore. These are places where development happened not because AID was there passing out billions of dollars. And the second thing is, where AID has passed out billions of dollars, the track record of success is pretty discouraging. I mean, I think Egypt would be a very good example of where substantial economic assistance has not produced a lot of lasting results. Now, you could say, well, I guess it's because all the people who work for AID are stupid and we just have to hire smart people. But I suspect actually we've had some smart people working the problem, and the problem is exceedingly difficult. You know, if you talk about economic assistance that would be meaningful to a country like Pakistan, where the population is 175 million. Yes. That is a country with a population that is more than 50% the size of the United States of America. So ask yourself how much money would have to be spent over how long a period of time to make it happen in Pakistan. And the answer is a real big number. And then you have to ask yourself, what would lead us to believe that the Congress of the United States and the people of the United States would be willing to sustain that level of commitment for 10 or 15 or 20 years? And the answer is there's nothing that would make us think that. I mean, the Kerry Lugar bill, $7.5 billion over 3 years?
5 years.
$7.5 billion over 5 years, and this is viewed as some kind of a big hoop-de-doo development. We spend $65 billion a month, $65 billion a year just in Afghanistan. Now, nobody bats an eyelash at spending $65 billion a year in Afghanistan, or that we used to be spending $100 billion a year in Iraq. But when it comes to spending money on that kind of a scale for economic assistance, it just ain't going to happen.
Sir?
Excuse me. I'm an alumni here at BU. I actually had Professor Basevich way back about 7 years ago as a freshman. So I try and come out every time he's speaking. My question has to do with, I think, the one thing besides geography that actually unites all three countries, and that is the religion, the majority religion, which is Islam. And to what extent is there simply a committed segment, and not an unsubstantial portion of the population, that is simply committed to Islam and its orthodoxy, both Shiite and Sunni, and will not adhere to any of the modernization efforts that seem to be the goal, or should be the goal, for the U.S. in that region? Thank you.
Hot potato?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. It's an important question, but I think when we talk about Islam, we have to realize that there's over 1 billion population, and there's a tremendous diversity, internal diversity among the Muslims. And just to, if I heard the questions correctly, to assume that there are certain segments that do not like modernization, or then because of the religion, I think it's a misreading of the religion. If you look at the history of Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Egypt, all these areas, you know, they were having a natural progression of their religion as it was part of the traditions intertwined with their economics, economy, their politics, kinship, whatever, you know, it was just developing. Again, you know, like in the case of Iran, religion was always there. But then, of course, modernization was taking place as it was just inevitable happening. But the fact that a revolution in 1979 occurred had little to do with Islam and more to do with the dissatisfaction that people felt that their government was an authoritarian dictatorship. We did have economic prosperity. Iran is a rich country. There was education. At that time, there were all these national educational policies that were being put in place. It wasn't that it was, often people make a mistake assuming that the revolution of 1979 was a religious revivalist Islamic movement. Far from it. It was a popular and genuinely revolution by people who were dissatisfied. Of course, you know, there were all groups in it. There were religious groups in that too, because they thought as a pressure group, that they thought some of their interests were not taken into account. But then you had, in the revolution, you had the Christians and the Jews and the Baha'is, and as far as religion is concerned, and different ethnic groups that were all involved. But of course, certain things happened, including, or most importantly, the attack by Saddam Hussein on Iran, where it quickly allowed certain groups to consolidate power and to become a more pronounced religious group. But even then, the state is not against modernization, against technology, against science. If anything, in fact, after the revolution, Iran has progressed, tremendously. So, and I can talk more, with greater certainty about Iran because I know about Iran more. So I'm just, warning or cautioning you against assuming that it's the religion that is the cause of dissatisfaction. Many other factors are happening in the region that has made people to express their dissatisfactions through the medium of religion. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind.
In Pakistan as well.
Sorry, can I just rephrase that? Maybe I wasn't clear. I was just saying that there is maybe a certain segment that is simply so committed to a mentality that is maybe in the 7th century that I'm not saying the whole population by any means is affected in that way, but it seems with the Taliban, with Ahmadinejad and his beliefs, there seems to me that there's something that cannot be overcome. Yeah, they may use modern weapons and internet to further their cause, but to what extent is it simply a mindset that will not allow them to move their country forward, whether it's culturally, morally, socially, in addition to modernization efforts? Thank you.
Well, I was objecting to that because I don't think Ahmadinejad's mindset is stuck in the 7th century. And he is very much for science. He might not be a democratic person, but he wants to move Iran into a realm that people have access to sciences, to internet. He may not allow some people, or they may just filter certain websites for political reasons, because the competitions, the competition may have in here, but has nothing to do with his mindset being stuck in the 7th century. They may, as I said, use the religious idiom to, in fact, talk about progress and also the control of the state, because they can talk about it. But it's far from being, stuck in the 7th century.
In Pakistan, also we have to again differentiate between different groups. There are some most of the groups, when you're talking about the radical ones, whether the Taliban or other groups, it's they're using religion. None of them are very theologically learned. They may not even believe in most of what they are talking about. But yes, they use it. And yes, they are very modern in science, technology, IEDs, everything else. They do learn. A number of them were engineers or doctors. So it's not that they are against modernity. What they're doing is that it's very that if you want to get somebody to follow you enough to actually kill themselves or kill somebody else along with them, you need to make them believe in something. And religion is sometimes one of the most convenient and easy ways to get you to convince somebody to do it. It doesn't have to do with that religion's beliefs. It has to do more with faith. Faith makes people do things, and you actually convince them. Whether you believe in it or not, you can actually convince an innocent person, somebody to do something, a heinous act in that name. Doesn't necessarily mean that you are against modernization. What it means is that you believe you've lost influence and power. So it's basically your struggle for power, for political power in some ways or the other. And what you're doing is you're using religion, you're using ideology, using these weapons to gain political power, indirectly or directly.
I probably disagree with my colleagues a little bit. I don't disagree on the specific case of Iran, because I think that, again, Iran is a very special case. And it seems to me that speaking as an outsider who doesn't know anything about this, that even to the extent to which the Islamic Revolution was hijacked by
I say it
religious-
wasn't Islamic. I
Okay.
said it was a revolution.
well, it was called Islamic at the time.
No,
wasn't
no, no,
okay.
it was not.
Let me correct myself. Then, to the extent that the revolution was hijacked by Islamists, is that fair? That project, to my mind, has utterly, totally, and completely failed.
Oh, I agree there.
And therefore, in the specific case of Iran, to my mind, in trying to think our way through what is a sensible policy, it's a huge mistake in that case to view the problem through an Islamic lens, as it were. I think the problem is completely different. That said, I think I would subscribe to what I understood to be the spirit of the question with regard to Al-Qaeda and its purposes, with regard to the Taliban in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and its purposes. And I don't know if the leaders are, in their espousing a religious perspective, are genuine or are sincere or are cynical any more than I know when President Bush announces that we're invading a country to spread liberty, do I know whether he's being sincere or he's being cynical and simply using a language that he knows is useful for mobilizing support. And I'm not sure it matters all that much. At the end of the day, I do believe, and wanting to be very insistent that I'm not trying to reduce this religion to which 1.4 billion people subscribe to some sort of a, like a bowl of porridge that, looks the same everywhere. It does seem to me that one of the sources of the conflict is a as yet unresolved internal debate over where religious belief or how religious belief fits in the modern world. The West underwent an analogous conflict, internal conflict, over a period of several centuries, and it was a bloody conflict. And it has more or less resolved itself so that we in the West more or less accept the notion that the public sphere and religion are two separate things, and religion is private, and whether that's good or bad, that's just the position we have come to. I don't see that reconciliation, or if you wish, that separation, as having been reached in some parts of the Islamic world. When I read the McChrystal, the famous leaked McChrystal strategy, one of the things that struck me about that document was the extent to which it seemed to be oblivious to the possibility that religious questions may figure in an important way in the unfolding of events in Afghanistan. And again, a moment ago when I was making a wisecrack about secularized Christian soldiers walking around spreading democracy and freedom and women's rights, it really seems to me that that proposition, if it's undertaken at all, needs to be undertaken with an acute consciousness of the sensitivity of some of those issues in the eyes of people who culturally and historically just come from a different place than we do.
Well, no, I wait until other questions. I mean, I don't disagree with some of the things you say. I agree that the revolution has failed, and in fact, the images I was trying to show you here, just to say how much, in fact, that speaks to that effect. And also, as far as this internal debate between the religion and, whether there is a space for religion or that, religion has to be more of a private matter. Again, we have to look at it historically and look at these countries, the Islamic countries, vis-a-vis relationships with what happened, in terms of colonialism. I would be a little bit careful about the U.S. talking about having really decided where the separation between religion and state. So I think given the resurgence of fundamentalism in this country and the dominance that they have, then it'd be very important to realize how religion has reestablished itself in this country and how it is manifesting itself. But that's a long discussion, and we can just have that later on. I'd like to hear from other people.
Let's go back, and we'll be going by how long you've been on your feet.
Yeah, right.
So please.
Hi, I'm Tara McNally. I'm a graduate student in anthropology, and I have a basic question. We keep talking about the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban in Afghanistan. There's three, are we compartmentalizing these three, or is it true? Some analysts say that, in effect, these are false compartmentalizations, that the borders are porous, and these groups are much more porous, all these years after 2001, and that if indeed it's more like one group as opposed to these three false compartments, wouldn't this idea of sort of surgically going against Al-Qaeda, wouldn't that be in effect hopeless, because we're not dealing with the bigger problem? I mean,
What's the bigger problem?
The bigger problem being the situations in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I mean, we can stay in Afghanistan and just deal with Al-Qaeda, but if we're not dealing with the bigger problem, bigger issues at stake in the region, then in effect, wouldn't we be just wasting our time and money?
When you say deal with the bigger issues, what do you have in mind?
Well, for example, there seems to be two discussions going on in Washington, D.C. right now. It seems to be we stay in Afghanistan and we focus strictly on Al-Qaeda, or alternatively, we stay in for the long haul, put more time and resources into Afghanistan and Pakistan, and somehow stabilize both governments. I guess my question to you is...
That's a plausible idea.
No, but why? Right, but your other idea that we just stay there and sort of selectively focus on Al-Qaeda, it's not just Al-Qaeda, if it's both the Taliban in Pakistan and the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Oh, okay. First of all, I take your point that we're slapping a label on, what can we call it? Would it be an anthropologically correct term, so I don't use one that's politically incorrect?
We're going to be taking out a blue book in about 2 minutes.
A network? A network?
Network.
Okay. We're slapping a label on a network that may be loosely organized. It's probably not hierarchical, in which different units may not share the same purpose, may not be a lot of centralized command and control. I would frankly acknowledge all that and would say that that's one of the reasons I don't think the threat is as great as some people seem to imagine. All I'm suggesting is that rather than occupying the country until the cows come home,
Right.
and using up all of your Social Security and Medicare benefits in the meantime, that we could at least examine the possibility of trying to ascertain who are the people who really want to kill us, and to try to kill them first. And in general, it seems to me that again, using terms very loosely, in general, the Taliban in Pakistan doesn't want to kill Americans unless they're in Pakistan. And the Taliban in Afghanistan, by and large, doesn't want to kill Americans unless they're in Afghanistan. Now, if the Taliban in Afghanistan should begin to develop an agenda in which they too were intent on knocking over skyscrapers, then at that point it might become necessary to expand the effort to deal with them. All I'm trying to say is I only want to try to kill people who want to kill us, rather than trying to undertake a nation-building effort, which I think would be unaffordable, unnecessary, and will probably end in failure.
Professor Pandey, you want to add anything?
I'll just touch on what Professor basically said. I mean, these groups are different in their goals, not necessarily in their ideological beliefs.
But some analysts have said that, you know, back in 2001, you could have used that sort of compartmentalization and said these groups have different agendas, but that since 2001 it's evolved, that these groups they're much more porous, and that there's interests across the border, so to speak.
There are interests across the border. I mean, there are interests between the jihadi groups in southern Punjab, the jihadi groups in Kashmir, the ones on the Pakistani Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, the Al-Qaeda, the Uzbek fighters there, the Chechen fighters, I mean, fighters from around the world who are also located in that region. But it's the aim. As Professor Besevich said, I mean, the Pakistani Taliban are more interested in Pakistan side of the border. They don't care that much about the Afghan side, unless for a certain period of time, they are, for certain reasons, just helping their compatriots or a friend for a certain period of time, maybe getting benefits of money or some other funding. Again, the Afghan Taliban concentrate their attention in Afghanistan, not so much on what's happening in Pakistan, unless the Pakistani military starts attacking them.
Okay.
So their aims are different. However, they do align and they do form United Mujahideen Council or a coalition for a certain period of time. But if push comes to shove, right in the end, if they have to choose, the Pakistani Taliban will try and avoid any help to the Afghan as long as the Afghan army and the US leave them alone.
Okay.
That's where the difference comes
I appreciate
in.
it. Thanks.
Thank you.
I mean, the question is, would the question be, and I don't know the answer to the question, you know, how many attacks, terrorist attacks, have the Afghan Taliban plotted in the West? And how many terrorist attacks have the Pakistani Taliban plotted in the West? Is the answer 0?
Yeah, I know.
How many terrorist attacks have Al-Qaeda plotted in the West? Well, substantial number. That's the only distinction I'm trying to make.
Yes.
This fellow here's been
Yeah, he's been standing for some time.
I think actually she's been
she beat me out.
longer.
Hi, my name's Molly. I'm a grad student in comm, and I was hoping you could speak to this. Some argue that we have destabilized Iraq more than, well, we've destabilized Iraq, we've destabilized Afghanistan. We have a moral responsibility to rebuild these countries. Could you just speak to that argument?
Well, I have very strong feelings on this issue. And first of all, and this is a very cynical view, but I believe my cynicism is justified, and that is that, like it or not, policymakers only consider moral considerations as an afterthought. That's not simply true of American policymakers. It's true of people who make policy in Pakistan and people who make policy in Iran and everywhere except probably, Finland or something like that.
And Norway, too, I think.
Norway, nice people in Norway. Furthermore, from a moral perspective, I agree that we have shouldered a significant moral responsibility to the people whose lives we have disrupted, to put it mildly. That said, how are we to establish the hierarchy of moral responsibility that we need to begin working our way down? I'm sure that if I were a soldier just back from Afghanistan, I would probably feel strongly that the Afghan people should be at the top of the list, because I would have seen their suffering. And so I would personally feel like, by God, we need to do something for the Afghans. But that's a nice personal view that shouldn't necessarily inform political judgments. So why don't the Mexicans come first, is my argument that I've been trying to make. I mean, we owe the Mexicans big time. The drug trade that is corrupting Mexican institutions, that has produced an epidemic of violence, not only the drug trade, but our liberal drug laws. Cripes the fact that we stole California from them 150 years ago.
You gotta
make
get
a
over that,
long,
really.
long list of ways that we've screwed the Mexican people. So why don't we fix Mexico first before we move on to Afghanistan? And of course, even to raise the issue is to realize how absurd it is that we're going to fix Mexico. I mean, how many hundreds of billions of dollars would that take? So on the one hand, I acknowledge these moral responsibilities. I'm just not sure why it is that Afghanistan or Iraq comes first, given the other places that we've messed up over time.
Professor Hayeri, do you want to talk about moral responsibility at all in that region as far as, would that be welcome for the U.S. to go in and act upon some moral responsibility that it felt?
Well, I think Professor Basowicz said it quite nicely, and by comparing, by giving the example of Mexico, he just brought out the absurdity of the whole thing. I think, these things should have been thought out, not as an afterthought, before they went in. And in fact, part of the problems that people have, at least I know again in Iran, is that precisely on that moral issues. And maybe the fact that sometimes they use religion to talk about moral responsibility, which may then gets confused by, having this, having been stuck in the religious framework. I think the U.S. does have a responsibility, does have moral responsibility, but how it should do it, I don't know.
Why would anybody from if Hillary Clinton shows up and says, "I'm here, I'm your friend," why would anybody given the slides you showed us about the history of U.S.-Pakistani relations, why would anybody from Pakistan believe an American policymaker when they say, "I'm here, I'm your friend, and I want to help you"?
Yeah, and in that sense, I was just going, actually, I don't want to make this young man wait, but speaking of moral responsibility and how we have changed or destroyed or created chaos in the internal lives of these countries, I was just reading New York Times today, and in fact, I would like to ask these questions too, and looking at the amount of money that CIA has been given to Karzai's brother, and that man is one of the ones who is involved in drug trafficking. So how are we to understand these things? Sometimes I'd like to have an answer for that, but I like to have the young man just ask a question.
I'm not sure who was up first. Was it you? Go, please.
Hi, my name's Anant. I'm a biochemistry major. I had a question regarding the nature of counterinsurgency that we're enacting in Afghanistan. You mentioned in your comments at the beginning that the timeline for our efforts regarding the counterinsurgency are looking to be lengthened. And history will show us that most counterinsurgencies go for around 15 years. And they usually never is there a military solution. It's usually a political settlement, if any at all. Do you believe that the nature and the way we enact our counterinsurgency policy can be revamped or changed so that we can facilitate the political settlement in Afghanistan? Thank you.
Well, see, they think they have the United States military, and the proponents of counterinsurgency think that they have found the answer. I mean, they rewrote this famous field manual, FM 3-24, under the guidance of General Petraeus, and then they applied that manual in Iraq in what proponents of counterinsurgency believe has been a great triumph, the surge. I reject that characterization, but that's what they think. And my point is, nobody within the military is interested in rethinking counterinsurgency because they're absolutely persuaded they've already done that and that they have done it successfully. If you read the McChrystal strategy, and it's worth looking at for 20 minutes or so, I mean, maybe you wouldn't get it, but there's a language in there that parrots a vocabulary related to the revised counterinsurgency doctrine that basically implies that they have a template and all they're going to do is slap the template on Afghanistan and implement it, and if they get enough resources and try hard enough, all will be well. Again, I think that's completely absurd, but that is, I think, the collective mindset of the Army and the Marine Corps these days.
Yes, sir.
I'm Jonathan. I'm a history major, history and IR. jumping off his question, if tomorrow the U.S. reevaluates its security concerns in especially Pakistan and Afghanistan and determines that it is unrealistic and ineffective to keep a counterinsurgency technique in these two countries, what is the most plausible and most effective way to still monitor our security concerns without having an overwhelming U.S. presence and disturbing their own process of nation building?
Professor Pandey, you want to go first?
I mean, it could be two ways. One could be what is being thrown up as the Biden plan, which is basically that continue with the drone attacks in northwestern Pakistan, maybe extend them to Balochistan, where some experts believe that remnants or a large part of the Afghan Taliban leadership is, and try and coordinate with the Pakistani intelligence to get more information. That's going to be tougher. Drone attacks have been successful to some extent in the region, but extending them to Balochistan is going to create more problems because up till now the Baloch insurgency is a nationalist insurgency, and they've never attacked the Americans across the border, or gone beyond attacking Pakistani security forces. So extending it in Balochistan would cause some problems. Secondly, getting more intelligence or information from the Pakistani intelligence is going to be difficult unless they trust you. And they know that you are not going to use it for some other purposes. So it is possible, but only if these criteria are met. For Afghanistan, I think he also wants to know if...
Well, I mean, we talked about that before, that I think the counterterrorism approach is at least the approach that deserves to be explored as an alternative. I think in Pakistan, I think we are trying to encourage the Pakistani army to see the threat of the Taliban as a serious threat. We are trying to persuade the Pakistani army to readjust its traditional hierarchies and not obsess about India. To the extent that we are successful in that urging, then it makes sense for us to provide security assistance in order to try to improve the capabilities of the Pakistani army. Although, again, at the end of the day, the contribution we can make is only on the margins, and success or failure will be determined by the army and the government and the people of Pakistan.
Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Alexander. I'm working and studying in the biomedical field here at BU. Actually, I have 3 questions, but I leave it up to you to
I think we only have
answer
time
one.
for
Yeah,
one
sure.
and a half.
I'm still going to ask that. So we were talking about these 3 countries. I was just wondering to get your opinion on the influence of a fourth one on Afghanistan.
Can you speak up a little bit, please?
Sure. Is that better? All right.
Yeah.
So I would like to get your opinion. We were talking about these 3 countries right now, and I would just like to get your opinion on the influence of a fourth one on Afghanistan. So what do you think is the influence of Saudi Arabia and their specific religious view on the Islam on Afghanistan? And specifically, what does Iran, the government, what would they think about their influence?
Okay, why don't we go with that one? Okay. Thank you. Professor Heyer,
I think that's a very good question. I mean, we have to look at other constellations of power in the region. And Saudi Arabia has been very, very important in terms of sending money, trying to convert, some of the traditions there they may perceive as, pagan and not correctly Islamic. So they try to create, to import or export rather, correct Islamic beliefs and traditions. And they have been successful. They pay a lot of money. They've been successful in Pakistan. They've been successful in Afghanistan as well. And in fact, that's part of the problem in Pakistan too, because I'm sure Aparna can talk about that more, but they spend huge amount of money in Pakistan. When I was, when we were living in Pakistan, I saw gradually the anti-Shi'i movement. I mean, not that I had much to do with it, but then, I was Iranian, and they hated my guts because both as an American and Iranian and Shiites, maybe on all 3 accounts, and I did get some flags, but you're right. I mean, that is important, and we have to understand that. But also there, I think what's important, and we often forget, is that, again, the role of U.S., Saudi Arabia, and its influence in Pakistan. When Afghanistan was occupied, or at least, some people wanted to have the Russians there, when it was under the Russian occupations, what was the relationship between the US and Saudi Arabia as far as Pakistan was concerned, and then later on Afghanistan? So I think your question is very well taken. I didn't get the second part of your question.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for a second
that's
part,
fine.
so I'm exercising moderator's prerogative and hijacking the proceedings now. Sir, I'm sorry, since you already had one bite at the apple, I'm going to have to preempt you here, because this is the time when we enter our crystal ball section of the program. And so I just want to go around the table and ask everybody, what do you see happen? Not what would you like to see, but what do you think you'll see happening a year from now in each one of these countries? Professor Party, you want to start?
I wish I had a crystal ball.
Yeah?
But the next 6 months to 8 months, I see more instability. In Pakistan, I see more attacks, and unless things change drastically, I see the civilian government either continuing in the same mode it is right now or getting a bit weaker. A lot will depend, however, on how the military offensive in the northwestern part of the country takes place. Is it successful? Successful in the sense that are they able to then let the local leaders sort of bring about some development and economic benefit to the region? Because if it's just going in, killing people and coming back, then the Taliban will come back and occupy those places. So are they able to take them, actually make a change in that region? And then lastly, how much of economic development takes place in the next 1 year? Do people get jobs? Do people get education, jobs? That's what the next 1 year, but I don't see anything.
Presumably would produce stability.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Professor Besovic?
I think the president's going to do kind of a Goldilocks and Three Bears approach to the Afghanistan issue. Not too hot, not too cold. This one's just right, and therefore he'll approve a modified version of the counterinsurgency strategy and probably deploy an additional 20,000 U.S. troops. I think the allies will probably contribute another 36 European troops. And it'll take months before the U.S. forces are on the ground. And therefore, a year from now, we will have a situation that is not yet resolved. We'll have a higher level of violence. And in effect, the president, a year from now, is going to find himself right where he is today, facing the need to make a basic decision about whether to go forward or try a different course. Although, second time around, the political risks or the political price to pay of taking a different course will be even greater. Mm-hmm. And he will regret the decision he's about to make.
Mm-hmm. Professor Hayari?
Well, if only we had a crystal ball, wouldn't that make our lives a lot easier? I would think that what may happen, what may develop in Iran the next year or so, it really has a lot to do with the way that the U.S. continues with its policies of trying to engage Iran. And given what happened in Iran during the election, it's too bad I couldn't show you the rest of the slides that I had made for you. But for now, the state, even though it claims that it has full legitimacy, it has lost much of its legitimacy, if not all of it. So for that matter, it knows that it is not really having a very strong power base in the country. So feeling weak there. And it's not just the people who are against or opposing the state. Many of the leaders themselves are fractured right now. There is the unity that they had at some point, it's no longer there. So the state is feeling the pressure from different corners, different pressure groups. So I would think if the U.S., the presidents, President Obama seems to have been very wise in its relations with Iran. And I hope he stops making the threat. The only thing that I wish he doesn't do it is just every time that he tries to stretch a hand and shake Iranian hands, which I think is very important in terms of trying to bring the the temperature down. Then he comes out with a very strong threat, which I don't think quite works. You have to understand people have certain sense of respect and honor that they want to maintain, certain public image that they want to maintain of themselves. So I would think that perhaps things would develop in Iran in a, I wouldn't say democratic sense, because I think the state is very much in control right now. But then if the U.S. comes in and allows, gets involved with Iran, or possibly there is a relationship between Iran and the U.S., then things would change for the better. And hopefully that bodes well for the relationship that Iran and Pakistan and Afghanistan may have together. So ultimately, it really all depends on the constellations of the event that will all have to take place before some desired effect is taking place.
Of course, if we did have crystal balls, then I wouldn't get to moderate panels like this, which has been an absolute pleasure. I thank all the panelists. I thank you all, and I have a safe and enjoyable night. Thank you.
Thank you.